Before the tragic events of March 31st, 1922, Hinterkaifeck was famous only for its rolling green fields, lush forests, and clear blue skies, idyllic Bavarian countryside. It hasn't changed, except if you visit, you might come across a small structure at the base of a tree, a plaque commemorating one of the most notorious unsolved homicides. This is the puzzling story of the Hinterkaifeck Axe Murders. The slaughter of the Gruber family, along with their nanny, is probably the most notorious unsolved crime in German history. A bizarre element of this case is that the killer seems to have actually lived inside the house for multiple days after the murders. Over 100 possible suspects have been interviewed, some many years after the killings, but still no one has ever been charged. If you like putting your mind to a cold case with several intriguing angles, this is really one for you. Even to the present day, detectives and police from all over the world continue to probe for a solution. In 2007, Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy re-examined the old leads. While they were not able to definitively prove any of the main theories, they were able to develop some conclusions. But they decided to keep these private in order to protect the living family members of the suspects. Let's go to the known evidence. But first, a warning. This case involves descriptions of very graphic murders, claims of child abuse, and incestual relationships. We'll discuss them matter-of-factly and only in an attempt to understand what might have led to the murders. The Gruber farm at Hinterkaifeck was previously owned by the Assams. Andreas Gruber, born in Greinstetten in 1858, the oldest of 5 children, married the widow, Kazilia Assam, who at the time owned the farm. Andreas, a man known to keep to himself and to his own, suffered much tragedy. 3 of his younger siblings died in childhood, and his youngest sister died at only 29. Andreas and Kazilia had 3 children, all of them girls. 1 daughter died at childbirth, and the other was 2 years old when she died. This left Victoria as their only child. Kazilia had 4 children by her previous husband, 2 of which survived to adulthood, but her son died in 1916 during World War I. Victoria's husband also reportedly died on the battlefield during the Great War. Victoria was then left with 2 children, 2-year-old Joseph and 7-year-old Kazilia, named after her grandmother. So, living inside the home at the time of the crime was Andreas and Kazilia, their daughter, Victoria, Victoria's 2 young children, and the maid, who had just begun working there that day and hadn't even had a chance to unpack her bags. The farm seemed fairly prosperous, but farm life is very secluded. Other than church on Sunday and occasional trips into town for supplies, they spent most of their time with each other. Soon enough, though, the peaceful domesticity of life at Hinterkaifeck was interrupted. Andreas started to notice puzzling things in and around his home. First was the discovery of odd footprints in the snow that led towards the house but never left. Then, 2 of the house keys went missing. Andreas found scratches on the lock to the shed. Then, an out-of-town newspaper that he didn't remember buying. The paper came all the way from Munich, about 40 miles away. 6 months prior to the murders, something really unsettling had occurred when their previous nanny quit because she claimed the house was haunted. She'd been hearing strange noises and footsteps coming from the attic. Despite the unusual things that Andreas himself had been seeing, he brushed the nanny's claims off. So she quit. But word of the unusual events at the farm spread, and it took 6 whole months for the Grubers to find another maid. Maria Baumgartner came to the farm with her sister on March 31st to apply for the job, to see if she would be comfortable despite the reports of unusual activity. Maria suffered from some kind of disability that we don't know about, which affected her both mentally and physically, which stopped her from getting jobs in the past. But obviously, her and her sister were comfortable enough for her to take this job, so she said goodbye to her sister. It would be her last goodbye. Unknown to any of them, that day, the killer decided to strike. Police speculate that the killer somehow lured each of the family members, one by one, into the barn. But who went first? It could have been Andreas, on his way to use a piece of equipment, or his wife or daughter going out to do a chore. Maria was killed inside her bedroom, as was 2-year-old Joseph. If any screams resounded into the night, no neighbors lived close enough to hear them. It took days for anyone to notice something was wrong. The first clue was when 7-year-old Kazilia didn't show up for school. Then, When no one showed up for church, people became concerned. Victoria was a member of the choir, and she was known to tithe generously, so the family's absence was noteworthy. Mail piled up, and no one in the family had been seen working in the fields. Finally, a search party was sent to check in on them, and they discovered a scene from their worst nightmares. The searchers entered the barn first. Using a mattock, a kind of pickaxe, the killer had bludgeoned each of the family members as they entered the barn. Reports describe the extreme gore found at the scene. Andreas's face was covered in blood, the skin shredded, his cheekbone sticking out. The elder Cazilia's skull was broken, and it appeared as though she had been strangled. Victoria showed signs of being hit repeatedly on the head, suffering similar skull fractures to her mother, and Cazilia. Poor, young Cazilia. She was found with a shattered jaw, her face and neck covered in slashing wounds. Most horrifically, this wasn't enough to kill her right away. Her hair was found clutched in her hands where she had pulled it from her own scalp out of absolute terror in the hours that she lay in the barn before eventually succumbing to her injuries. Upon entering the house, the search party discovered little Joseph slain in his crib, his body covered in a dress. Maria, not even 24 hours into her new life, was found brutalized in much the same manner as the rest of the family, her body covered in a sheet. The search party contacted the police right away. The family had been dead multiple days by the time they were found, and the killer had long since fled, but not before living in the house for multiple days. Besides the family's typical hermetical attitude, part of the reason it took so long for any of the neighbors to realize that anything was wrong was that the farm was still fully functioning. The animals were cared for, and smoke billowed from the chimney. Additionally, when the search party had arrived, all of the doors were locked. The police conducted a vigorous investigation at the time, and many investigations were launched over the decades. Over 100 potential suspects were interviewed. No stone was left unturned, but all to no avail. Many theories have been formed, but nothing definitive. And no charges. Rumors spread, various theories emerged, and for each question that was answered, 5 new questions resulted. One troubling charge was that Andreas had maintained an incestuous relationship with his daughter, Victoria. In fact, 7 years before the murders, in 1915, the charge of incest became official. A neighbor had reported on them, and the father and daughter both served time in jail for the crime. Andreas, a year, and Victoria, a month. When Victoria gave birth to Joseph, there were grumblings about who the real father was. But the witnesses who originally brought this allegation to court later withdrew their statements under oath, which calls it into question. In fact, the main witness seems to have been Victoria's lover, Joseph's potential father, so he possibly had his own incentive for making such a charge. Another sign of trouble in the family was that Cazilia showed signs of being malnourished and possibly the victim of abuse. We don't know what the specific evidence was. We don't even know who brought the allegations up, so it remains unsubstantiated. Now let's get into some of the theories. First on the list is Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, reported to have died during the First World War in 1916. But his body was never found, and some wondered if he took the opportunity to flee his old life under the cover of enemy shelling. After World War II, German prisoners in Soviet captivity were released by a German-speaking Russian officer, claiming to be the Hinterkaifeck murderer. Was this Victoria's husband, Carl? It might explain why the killer was able to keep the farm running for days after the murders, as he would have had that knowledge. But what would his motivation have been for the murders? If the incest rumors were true, this might have provoked his rage. But why kill his own daughter? Why come back at all 6 years after his presumed death? If the POW story was true, Carl had escaped the war to resettle in the USSR. Why come home years later just to kill your wife and her family? Perhaps the horrors of the war had unhinged his mind. Maybe rage about his incestuous in-laws had festered. The whole thing seems more likely to be the kind of tall tale that can emerge in very notorious cases, such as Jack the Ripper. The second suspect on the list is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. This was a neighbor of the Grubers, Victoria's lover, and the presumed father of Joseph. Lorenz and Victoria had been in a relationship since 1918. He was among the search party that discovered the crime. Reports are that he acted strangely. Lorenz helped break open the gate to enter the barn, but he used a key to enter the house, and he went alone while the others were still in the barn. This made Lorenz guilty in the court of public opinion. Apparently, comments he made later on only increased suspicion. For example, comments suggested to some of the locals that he had knowledge only the killer would have. On one occasion, when a local teacher saw him visiting the memorial at the farm, He commented on how the frozen winter ground had stopped the killer from being able to bury the bodies. Did he know this from personal experience? Or was he just guessing that the killer had wanted to bury the victims? When asked why he had entered the house alone during the initial search for the family, he said it was to look for his son, Joseph. This seems more than reasonable to us, but to a local population desperate to know who the killer was, it indicated guilt. The idea that someone, like what we would now call a serial killer, might be a stranger that came into town and who killed just for the pleasure of killing was not something that they were capable of thinking about at that time. So the locals sought a local solution. They searched for motives, they explored connections. Frustrated in their efforts, they might seize on small things as indications of guilt, things that really were not. Was it unreasonable that Lorenz, a neighbor and father of the young boy, would have a key? Was it unreasonable that he would be quick to check the house to see if his son was still alive? It doesn't seem so. Could Lorenz have been motivated by not wanting to support Victoria and the child financially? Perhaps. But to murder 6 people? Could something else in their relationship have triggered such rage? Sure. But there's no evidence for any of this, and the basis of suspicions by the locals seem far short of convincing. Some intriguing suspects didn't have a clear-cut means or motive, but the evidence against them, if not compelling, is tantalizing. For example, there were the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton, who had connections to a paramilitary organization called the Freikorps Oberland. Their sister claimed on her deathbed that the brothers had committed the murders. However, nothing else connects them to the case. These kind of false allegations are not uncommon in notorious murders, and it's why modern police withhold details of the crime scene that only the killer would know. Another woman claimed that she witnessed 2 men, Carl and Andreas S., confess to the murders to her mother. But again, no evidence was found linking them. Multiple men who had worked for the family were considered as suspects, as they would have known their way around the farm, and may have had reasons to kill the family, either for their money or out of disdain for their previous employers. But the police didn't have enough evidence to pursue any of these leads further. For decades, the police chased lead after lead, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, but nothing definitive turned up. Recently, researcher Bill James published a book called The Man from the Train, where he documents a mysterious axe killer that struck in a wide path across the United States over a period of many years. This killer, traveling by train, would get off at a quiet town or village, break into the home of a family late at night, hack to death everyone inside, then leave the area by train. Like the Hinterkaifeck killer, this fiend used an axe to not only kill his victims, but to butcher them, almost beyond recognition. He had no motive, other than his own perverse pleasure in killing. Using analysis of archived local newspapers, James identified a suspect, Paul Mueller. And he thinks Mueller, originally from Germany, might have returned there by 1922, and could have been in Hinterkaifeck. Most of the murders ascribed to the man on the train were between 1909 and 1912, but James also cites murders occurring years earlier and years later. It's possible that the man from the train stopped killing at times because he was in jail for other crimes. The first axe murders James thinks Mueller was behind took place in Massachusetts in 1897. He also believes Mueller committed the notorious Volusia, Iowa axe murders in 1912. There were dozens of families murdered like this during this period, most of them near train lines, most of them in low population rural areas where it would take time for police to respond. He'd break in through the back door and ambush his victims, usually while they were in bed, often using the blunt end of an axe to crush the victims' heads. His signature was that he usually covered the bodies and the windows with sheets or something similar afterward. Until fairly recently, police and the public were not much aware of the existence of motiveless killers, people who kill for pleasure, serial killers. But the man from the train struck so many times that even back then, some people were starting to wake up to the fact that they had a wild killer traveling by rail and striking at random. Bill James suggests that this public awareness might have been what led to him returning to Germany before finally getting caught. It's not a perfect match. There were no rail lines near Hinterkaifeck, and the windows inside the farmhouse were not covered, but the bodies were covered. The victims in the barn had hay moved over their faces, and the nanny inside the house was covered with a sheet. It's a bit of a stretch, but who knows? Finally, we ask, is it worth trying to speculate on this horrific case, or is this just some kind of gruesome voyeurism. We argue that there are benefits, as an intellectual exercise, of course, but also as a way of gaining insights into human nature. How do people within the community react when such crimes happen? How do they form their suspicions? How do local police investigate? And what can we learn generally from these cases that might gain us insights into similar cases? Maybe these are the reasons that you're interested in true crime. Thank you so much for joining us today on this little journey into the Hinterkaifeck Axe Murders. We hope that you can join us again. If you'd like to join us again, all you have to do is click the subscribe button in 3, 2, 1. Additionally, if you liked this video and you want to let us know, click the like button. Let us know what you thought about the case in the comments. Not only does this help us to make our videos better, but the engagement helps our videos get seen by more people. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.